Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for continuing to join us for this study on grief and loss. I want to thank everyone who has joined us so far. And if you're joining us for the first time, don't worry, you can go back and watch the previous week's meditations on this YouTube page so that you can catch up a little bit. You're also always welcome to join us on Sundays, either in person or online, for the grief class after worship on Sundays. So whether you've been to one of those before or you've watched the meditation, there is no prerequisite for coming to that course or coming to that class, rather. I do want to thank everybody who did come and who shared and was vulnerable enough to talk about grief in a setting with some folks they may not have known. So that was really wonderful. This second week, as we continue to work through The Smell of Rain on Dust, I really wanted to focus on the second chapter of this book. So the first chapter, we talked about some of what grief is. We talked about how it's natural, how it's necessary, how you shouldn't postpone it, and how it gets us to a place of praise because we are offering our expressions of grief for a loss we've felt, whether it's of something or someone, and that grief sounds like us being alive, and that we are grieving the fact that we are alive and the person or the thing that we have lost is no longer. So as we transition to that, Martin talks about how the first place to start is to talk about our first loss. Now, some of us may think that to think about our first loss is, when's the first time I went to a funeral? Or when's the first time I lost a loved one? Or maybe when's the first time I remember crying about the loss of something? And so we try to go back to our childhood. This is a good practice, but Martin actually encourages us that our first loss for everyone occurs at the same time. We all experience our first loss the day that we are born. Think about that. That we experience our first moment of grief the instant we come into the world. And what is it that we would be grieving in that moment? Well, we're grieving the womb that we have been in for 9 months. So Martin, in his second chapter of the book, goes through a very detailed list of the things that we get comfortable with in the womb of our mother, how we are nurtured in that womb, how we are fed in that womb, how our heartbeat syncs up with the heartbeat of our mother. And so we begin to come accustomed to that as knowing our home for that 9 months. That's all that we know. And so when you frame it like that, when you're born, when you leave that womb, and we think about, oh, it's beautiful to hear a baby cry when they're born because that tells us that they're well. That is actually that baby grieving a loss. So it's not pain. The child's not feeling pain. The child's actually feeling sorrow and sadness in a way. That they are leaving this dark, warm, comfortable, symbiotic relationship that they have with their mother, and they're coming out into, they don't know what, bright, loud, noise-filled, and they don't know it yet, but crazy world that they're about to enter into. So there's fear and there's sadness in that moment. Let me read you the final page of this chapter, and maybe this might help illuminate that for you a little bit more. Martin says, the loss of our mother's heartbeat and the loss of the hungerless life in the womb are so traumatic and gigantic an event in every child's immediate beginnings as to cause all of us, as newborns, to utilize the very first inhalation of our tiny little lungs to cry out in grief. While the very first breath we take burns our still unhardened tender chest of lungs, still we instinctually know from this very onset of our life as an air-breathing human creature that we must sing out our grief in a glorious musicality with that first exhale. Our very lives start out from the very beginning by us crying out as hard as we can in a newly found voice. Not in a not in a complaining sequel of rage for not having things stay the same, but in a sorrowful musical wail, tiny and beautiful, that says, "Mama, where are you? Where am I? I'm cold and alone here without your drumming heartbeat." It's a grief poem, a song. As humans, we start our lives from the very first instant with a deep artistic expression of our first loss. Not with a phlegmatic smile, nor with a void, empty slate, but with a truly, elegantly active spiritual intelligence that knows we must sing grief, a song, whose grandeur, even for its smallness, has all adults in hearing distance tearing up as well. Because all real grief causes all to grieve. I really like that detailed depiction of our first loss, of our first moment of grieving, and comparing that grief to a song. So last week we talked about how grief can be expressed through art. And Martin is continuing on that trend, which says, when we cry at our birth, that is our first artistic expression of our grief. So it's expressing in art, but it's also expressing confusion, sadness, anger, all sorts of emotions when we haven't even been alive for less than a minute. Martin also talks about how when a baby cries when they're first born, and usually everyone in the room has some sort of reaction, whether they're crying as well, but they're moved in some way. Maybe they're relieved to hear the baby crying. Maybe they're joyous to hear the baby crying, or maybe they're sad. Whatever the feeling, we're brought into that grief process by this child's crying. And so that's what Martin means by all real grief. When we really truly grieve, it causes all of us around to grieve as well. So this week, I hope you'll join us on Sunday so that we can continue our discussion in what we're grieving, who we're grieving. And then I want us to spend some time this week thinking about either our own stories of coming into this world. Maybe you can talk to your parents about what that was like. Or if you are a parent yourself, think about what that was like when you birthed your child, when your child came into the world, and thinking of it in a way of grief, of what healthy grief looks like. I hope you'll consider joining us. Thanks.